praise continue? Well, we're just into chapter 3, of course. It's Habakkuk's psalm and his prayer. Until verse 4 of chapter 3, Habakkuk gave praise for God's work in the past and his petition for Yahweh to revisit those past works in his own day. Now with verse 4, Habakkuk abruptly moves, in past tense, he moved to praise God for his judgment of Judah. Remember, that was one of the things Habakkuk wished, that Judah would undergo a period of judgment in order to be reconciled back to their God. So let's read Habakkuk 3, verses 4 and 5. We've been through 4 before. We'll add to it. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hands, and there he veiled his power. Verse 5. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. Light, of course, is associated with the presence of God and his glory. So verse 4 tells us that God's brilliance was his manifestation in the heavens. God's power, his right hand, his right arm, his omnipotence is veiled. That power is hidden in his hand until the moment he sends it forth to do his will. In other words, God has more power than we see. We will only see it as he executes it. In this case, God's will centered on Judah's judgment first, and then to follow with the judgment of Babylon for its evil work in doing God's will. Yahweh is sovereign. His judgment is a sovereign act. But don't forget, reconciliation is also Yahweh's sovereign act. So he judges, yes, but he reconciles also, yes. Habakkuk then moved on from God's manifestation in the heavens, this flashing of lightning and so forth, to his manifestations on earth. First, we're going to look at some terms that came up in verse 5. Pestilence, for example. That's typically a disease that will bring death. In Exodus 9:15, for example, when God was speaking to Pharaoh at the 7th plague, he told Pharaoh, "For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth." What was he telling Pharaoh? Look, I'm giving you a chance to reconcile with me. I'm giving you a chance to recognize me. If I wanted to, anywhere along this way, I could inflict such pestilence on you that Egypt would be no more. Now the word plague, that often refers to a fevered condition that's associated with that pestilence. Anyhow, it says that when God is doing his judgment, pestilence and plague, those undesirable facts of life, are present. Pestilence and plague are Old Testament terms, again, most often related to God's sovereign work in judgment, where his power was unveiled for all to see. And pestilence reminds us of God's miracles performed through Moses before the face of Pharaoh in Egypt. The 10 plagues in Egypt were his sovereign acts. Exodus 9:3 says, "Behold, the hand of the Lord," that is his sovereign act, "will fall upon a fall with a very severe plague upon the Egyptians' livestock that are in the field, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks." Psalm 78:50 speaks likewise. God, in dealing with Egypt, says this, He made a path for His anger. He did not spare them from death, but gave their lives over to the plague. So God did inflict death during some of those plagues in Egypt. His response to the golden calf incident was also a sovereign act. Exodus 32, verse 10, and then we'll skip down to verse 34. Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath, this is God speaking to Moses, that my wrath may burn hot against them, the Israelites, and I may consume them in order that I may make a great nation of you, Moses. Down to verse 34. But now go, and this is after Moses pled and interceded for Israel. God says, but now go, lead the people to the place about which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you, the angel of Yahweh, we suspect. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit there the Israelites' sin upon them. Then the Lord sent a plague on the people because they made the calf, the one Aaron made. So he has another plague later on in this wandering time, the so-called plague of serpents. This was in the wilderness, and it was also a sovereign act of God in judgment on his own people. And this is a period of time when the Israelites were moving around Edom. They weren't going to go through Edom. They were going around Edom on the east, to the east of the Dead Sea, and they were headed for the Promised Land. Numbers 21, verses 5 and 6. And the people spoke against God and Moses. Who have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food, no water, and we loathe this worthless food. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, that they bit the people, so that many of people of Israel died. Pestilence, you remember that scene. That's where the bronze serpent on a pole comes into play and later became an idol in Israel as well. Now, pestilence was even seen when Israel was disciplined for covenantal disobedience. We see that spelled out in Leviticus 26, verse 21. Then if you walk contrary to me and will not listen to me, going to skip to verse 25, I will bring a sword upon you that shall execute vengeance for the covenant. And if you gather within your cities, I will send pestilence among you, and you shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. And then Moses, on his swan song, in Deuteronomy 28, verses 21 and 22, the Lord will make the pestilence stick to you until he has consumed you off the land that you are entering to take possession of it. The Lord will strike you with wasting disease and with fever, inflammation and fiery heat, and with drought and with blight and with mildew. They shall pursue you, that's the enemy, until you perish. So in the blessings and cursings that Moses gave as his swan song, the same thing happens. So most of the time, again, did you notice that the pestilence, the plague, the threats were all aimed at Israel as a form of judgment? Well, suppose an unbeliever approaches you concerning any of these passages on judgments, and he asks you, how can you not see your God as a vindictive tyrant bent only on making you submit to his will? How can you claim he's a God of love? Well, how would you respond? I'm not going to discuss that at this point. I've avoided that all along, but these are the kinds of things you need to think about. How would you tell somebody that that is characteristic of a loving God when he says it's just the opposite? Well, let's go back to Habakkuk. His focus, Habakkuk's focus, remained firmly on the Lord as he's going to describe Yahweh's center of attention, his power, and his ways of dealing with mankind. Verse 6, Habakkuk 3. He stood and measured the earth, that's Yahweh. He looked down and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered, the everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways, the unchanging ways he deals with man. Stood and measured tells us that God's always informed, always aware, always on top of all that happens in the world, anywhere, at any time. The description looked and shook, or convulsed would be a good word for shook, could be the result of an earthquake brought about simply by God's stare. Regardless, God truly is all-powerful, and his universal response at his power and acts was fear, a sense of awe among believers, fright, even terror among unbelievers. Remember Babylon's making nations in their path fear? Well, that's the same kind of fear that comes to unbelievers when they know they're seeing the power of God. Go back and check Habakkuk 1:7 to see that this is characteristic of a feeling of terror, the fear that comes in those situations. The earth itself was to experience Yahweh's displeasure. The mountains and hills of verse 6 are generally considered constant, stable elements of creation, but they both would evaporate under God's stare. Didn't even have to say a word, apparently. Only Yahweh is eternal. Mountains are not eternal. Hills are not eternal. Rivers are not eternal. Oceans are not eternal. God is eternal. Yet nations and individuals continue to worship elements of creation rather than the Creator. That's the main focus of the end of chapter 1 of Romans, with Paul writing in Romans 1, starting in verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. A bad swap, my friends. At that time, during the Exodus wandering, the enemy's fear of God was evident. We see that in verse 7 of Habakkuk 3. It says, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian, that would be the curtains of the tents in the land of Midian, did tremble. Now, Midian, recall, was a nation south of Judah, east of the Dead Sea, in the upper west corner of the Arabian Peninsula. And Cushan seems to be likely a nomadic people group in that same vicinity, the vicinity of Midian. Or it could be that Cushan is simply another name for Midian itself. That's not truly known. Moses had a wife from Midian, a daughter of the priest Jethro, as you recall, who gave him 2 sons. And he had a wife from Cushan, it's mentioned later. Whether he had 1 wife or 2 is debated, because they say if Cushan also represents Midian, then it could just simply be another way to describe his wife, Jethro's daughter. We see these 2 appear in Exodus 18:1. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law. So Moses had a wife who was a daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian. Numbers 12:1. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. Now, was that the same woman that he married as a daughter of Jethro? That's debated still. Well, the sense of verse 7 was that there was some serious difficulty facing those nomadic peoples. The reference to the tents and curtains as being, in conflict or afflicted, was certainly reference to the inhabitants themselves. In other words, the people in the region of Midian were upset at what they saw during God's powerful works in the wanderings. Evidently, God was the cause of their difficulty, as Habakkuk's vision follows the events of verse 6. Now, just by way of reminder, Israel had difficulty when passing through Midian on the way to the Promised Land. They were skirting around Edom. God said, you can't have any of the land of Edom, go around it. So they did. It went through Midian. And in Numbers 22 to 25, you see the episode of the king of Midians, the Midianites, and Balaam, B-A-A-L-A-M, the seldom considered good for anything prophet, who was hired to curse Israel, but whom God turned around and said, you will in fact bless Israel. The king of Midian had hired Balaam to curse them, as we said, but God intervened. The Israelites, however, later, at Balaam's suggestion to the king, they were seduced by the Midianites through idolatry and were chastised with a plague, chastised by God with a plague at that time. Many thousands died. Now, God had given Israel encouragement during their sojourn by telling them that nations would dread and fear them. Deuteronomy 2, verse 25, for example. This is God's. This day I will begin to put the dread and fear of you on the peoples who are under the whole heaven. In other words, every nation you come into contact with is going to be scared to death of you. Who shall hear the report of you and shall tremble and be in anguish because of you. Actually, they were in trouble. They would tremble and be in anguish because of God's power that was supporting Israel. But God said, they're going to look at you and they're going to be nervous. The phrase report of you, that same expression that Habakkuk used in 3:2, describing what he had heard of God's past works on Israel's behalf. That's the phrase he uses here. They're going to get reports of Israel's power that's supported by their God. Evidently, the fear of Israel was based on the word-of-mouth testimony that spread throughout the region. Anytime something happened somewhere that God gave Israel victory, that word got around quickly and other people began to fear the powerful nation that was walking through their territory. So far, Habakkuk has given us an image of the excellent Exodus that he held in his heart. Remember, the Exodus is the most powerful event in Israeli history, because that's when their redemption and their choice by God as a chosen people took place. Now, through these verses, Habakkuk makes it clear that God's power was evident to nations other than Israel, particularly the Amorite kings east of the Jordan and north of Midian. All of those who were in the way of getting upwards from Midian to the north in order to cross the Jordan. Those kings were scared to death of Israel's arrival. But soon after crossing the Red Sea, however, God had given the Israelites a similar encouragement. Exodus 15, verses 14, 15, and 16. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. That's the Philistines, of course. Now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed. Now, Edomites are a little nervous too. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab, cousins of the Jews, of course. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fell upon them because of the greatness of your arm, talking about God. They are still as a stone till your people, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased. God purchased them out of Egypt, made the people of the land that they were going to, scared to death of them, become paralyzed in their presence. And just as they were about to cross the Jordan in the promised land, we have another such example. Joshua 5:1. As soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all of the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan, which is how they got across the Jordan, of course, for the people of Israel, until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, that's those in Canaan, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. So what do we take away from these short 3 verses? Well, number one, God's majesty is visible everywhere in creation. God's sovereignty includes both acts of terrible judgment and unbelievable acts of love and reconciliation. In our next session, Habakkuk's going to address God directly and vividly about his judicial actions against those who oppose him, the so-called lex talionis, the law of retribution. We'll look forward to seeing you at that time. Next session. Good day.